For generations, families scattered across the Appalachian Mountains passed down the same careful explanation. We're Black Dutch, they'd say. Dark hair, dark eyes, a complexion that didn't quite match their neighbors, all explained away with two words that sounded safely European. It was never really about the Netherlands. And in 2012, DNA finally revealed what those two words had actually been hiding for over 200 years. This is the real story behind one of the most persistent ancestry myths in American history, and the genetics that finally cracked it open. For most families who use the term, Black Dutch was simply inherited family knowledge, repeated without much explanation. Some believed it referred to darker complexioned Germans, so-called Black Forest Germans or Palatine refugees, whose features stood out among lighter Anglo-Saxon neighbors. Others attached it to a wider swirl of exotic origin stories that circulated through isolated mountain communities for 2 centuries. Portuguese sailors, Turkish traders, Romani travelers, even shipwrecked Mediterranean explorers who supposedly intermarried with local tribes long before English colonists ever arrived. The common thread running through nearly every version was simple. Whatever this ancestry actually was, it was framed as safely non-black and safely non-native, 2 categories that carried real legal danger throughout much of American history, danger that only deepened as the decades passed. That framing itself is the first real clue that something more complicated was going on. The term became especially associated with a specific group of Appalachian families known as the Melungeons, communities centered around Newman's Ridge in Hancock County, Tennessee, and neighboring counties in Virginia and North Carolina. Melungeon families were documented as early as the late 1700s, already established, already distinct, their mixed features setting them apart from both their white and black neighbors, in ways that confused outsiders for generations. Certain surnames appear again and again in the historical record of these communities. Collins, Gibson, Goins, Bunch, and Sizemore among them, families whose descendants can now be traced across dozens of Appalachian counties and eventually across the country as later generations moved west in search of land and anonymity alike. Local writers in the 1800s speculated wildly about their origins. Lost tribes, ancient explorers, nearly every theory except the one that genetics would eventually confirm. In 2012, a team of researchers, Roberta Estes, Jack Goins, Penny Ferguson, and Janet Crane, published a landmark study in the Journal of Genetic Genealogy, titled simply Melungeons, a multi-ethnic population. The team tested the Y chromosome DNA, passed from father to son, of men descended from the core historical Melungeon surname lines, along with the mitochondrial DNA, passed from mother to child, of women in the same family network. Here is the first real crack in the myth. The paternal lines, the Y chromosome DNA carrying each family's surname forward through history, split almost exactly in half between 2 ancestries, roughly half traced to Western European origins, the other half traced to haplogroup E1b1a, a Y chromosome lineage overwhelmingly associated with sub-Saharan Africa. Only one core paternal line, the Sizemore family, showed Native American Y DNA. Whatever story generations of families had told themselves, and told the census takers, and told their own children, the paternal ancestry driving these core surnames was, in significant part, African. Then came the detail that made the whole picture snap into focus. Every single maternal line the researchers tested, traced through mitochondrial DNA passed down from mother to daughter across generations, came back European, not African, not Native American, European every time. That specific combination, African fathers and European mothers, sitting at the founding generation of these family lines, is not the pattern most people expect when they picture early colonial America. And understanding why it happened requires understanding a detail of colonial Virginia law that most people have never heard of. Picture Virginia in the decades before racial slavery hardened into the rigid, brutal system it would later become. In the early to mid-1600s, the legal lines separating free and enslaved black and white were still being drawn, and drawn inconsistently, colony by colony, decade by decade. Free African men, some formerly indentured servants, who had earned their freedom the same way many European indentured servants did, working the same tobacco fields for the same fixed number of years before being released, lived and worked alongside European settlers, and in a number of documented cases, formed relationships and had children with European women, some of whom were themselves indentured servants working alongside them, sharing the same hardship, the same distance from home, the same uncertain future. Under Virginia law, after 1662, a child's legal status as free or enslaved followed the mother's status, not the father's, a legal principle with roots in Old English common law, repurposed for entirely new and darker purposes in the colonies. A child born to a free European mother was born free, regardless of the father's race. For a narrow window of early colonial history, before later laws closed that door entirely, This was one of the only paths by which mixed-race families in the American South began their lives free rather than enslaved. That window didn't stay open for long. As the 18th century progressed, Virginia and neighboring colonies passed increasingly harsh laws targeting free people of color, restricting land ownership, voting rights, and legal testimony, and criminalizing marriage across racial lines entirely. Free families who had started out with real legal standing found that standing eroded year by year, statute by statute, as colonial legislatures grew more anxious about maintaining a clear, enforceable boundary between white and black. Families who had begun as free, mixed communities in the 1600s found themselves 100 years later facing a legal and social system actively working to strip away the rights their ancestors had secured. Many of these families migrated west and south into the isolated hollows and ridgelines of the Appalachian Mountains, deliberately choosing terrain too difficult and too remote to attract much outside scrutiny, trading the fertile lowland farmland that had sustained their grandparents for steep, rocky ground that at least came with the privilege of being left alone. Here is the twist that explains where the phrase Black Dutch actually came from. Isolation bought these communities distance, but it didn't buy them permanent safety. Census takers, tax collectors, and neighbors still asked questions, and the answers still carried consequences. Being recorded as mulatto or free person of color could mean losing the right to vote, testify in court, or even remain in a county at all. Calling yourself Black Dutch or Black German or French offered a plausible, difficult-to-disprove European alternative, one that let a family keep its land, its rights, and its safety, without requiring anyone to lie about the visible fact of their ancestry. It wasn't really about claiming Dutch heritage at all. It was a legal shield, built out of two ordinary-sounding words, protecting an ancestry that the law had made dangerous to name honestly. This pattern intensified into the 20th century. Virginia's 1924 Racial Integrity Act formally codified the one-drop rule, threatening legal and social consequences for anyone with any documented non-white ancestry, regardless of appearance, regardless of how many generations removed, regardless of how thoroughly a family had otherwise assimilated into the surrounding white community. The law required racial classification on every birth certificate and marriage license in the state, giving local registrars sweeping power to challenge and reclassify entire families based on little more than rumor and appearance. Families who had used the Black Dutch explanation for a century already had every reason to keep using it, and to genuinely believe it themselves by the time it reached their grandchildren, since by then the original reason for the euphemism had faded into the deeper background of family memory, leaving only the explanation itself repeated as plain and simple fact. So when a modern DNA test traces someone back to a Black Dutch great-great-grandmother, the science and the family story turn out to agree on something important and disagree on something else. The story was right that something needed explaining, a real ancestry that didn't fit the categories available at the time. It was wrong, or more precisely, deliberately incomplete about what that ancestry actually was. Not swarthy Germans, not lost Portuguese sailors. In many documented cases, a founding generation of free African fathers and European mothers, forming families in the earliest and least rigid years of colonial Virginia, whose descendants spent the next 250 years finding increasingly careful ways to keep the truth just quiet enough to survive. The DNA didn't uncover a scandal. It uncovered a survival strategy built by families who understood exactly what was at stake and who protected each other the only way the law of their time allowed. Black Dutch was never really a nationality. It was an act of protection, passed down so effectively that even the families repeating it eventually forgot it had ever been anything else. There's something worth sitting with in how completely that protection worked. A phrase invented to survive one generation's laws ended up surviving for 10, repeated at kitchen tables by people who had no idea they were reciting a legal strategy their ancestors had built out of pure necessity. By the time DNA testing finally caught up with the truth, the euphemism had outlived the danger it was built to prevent by well over a century. What the science ultimately restores isn't just an accurate family tree. It's the memory of an ordinary, human, and quietly radical fact that in the earliest days of colonial America, love and family formed across racial lines the law would later work furiously to erase, and that the descendants of those unions survived anyway, carrying the truth forward in code until it was finally safe enough to say out loud.